Hey there friends, Mr. E here, and today talking about this ability right here, Telekine Shield, the bubble more specifically. This recently saw an update with this most recent patch, a nerf in some senses, a buff in some others, and I really wanted to give it the rundown, and probably a lot of people out there wondering, is this ability still any good? Should I be bringing this? How is this going to impact the meta of like the bubble Psyker, right? The bubble Psyker is such a sort of everywhere thing. It's just such a good ability, or was such a good ability. Maybe this nerf killed it, and that's what I'm here to explore today. So we'll be exploring that by explaining the actual practical changes to this ability, both sides, not only the bubble but also the pains of shield as well, and then analyzing the math behind the change and how the math explains what this change really means for the Psyker. So before I start, reminder, if you want to learn more about Darktide, you want to understand the changes that are coming to the game, you want to see builds, etc., you just got to follow the channel, subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate everyone who does. And we also need to travel into the past, guys, because we need to look at the old talent tree. So I went on Wayback Machine here and I pulled up early March 11th of 2026. So this is pre the patch. So this is the old version of Telekine Shield. And this has differences all throughout it. There's a bunch of changes with this patch. So let's go ahead and run down on what the old version was. Then we'll show the new version and I'll explain the differences. And then we'll really get into the details on the differences. And I'll talk about whether or not I think this actually changed anything for the ability. So Telekine Shield has a 17.5 second duration and a base cooldown of 45 seconds. Cool enough, right? That's just the base shield. On the right side, which is where like 99% of people were going, Telekine Dome. Telekine Shield now forms a spherical shield which lasts 25 seconds, and it has no modifier to the time there, to the cooldown. So 45 seconds base cooldown stays, right? And this out here, Sanctuary, that has nothing to do with cooldown. It's just a really, really impactful extra node that you 100% are taking if you're taking the bubble, right? Okay, over here on the left side is another change that we'll see in a second for the Pain Shield, the single wall shield, Enervating Threshold, which just blocks specialists and electrocutes these enemies that are passing through it. This right here isn't really important to our discussion today, other than the positioning here, because Bolstered Shield is the one that gives 2 charges on this ability, and it lowered the cooldown of the single shield to 35 seconds. Okay, so keep all that in the front of your mind. We had no change in the time, the cooldown for this one makes the spherical shield last 25 seconds. The base shield is 45 with a 17.5 second duration, and the double shield decreases that cooldown to 35 seconds. All right, let's go back to the live version here and look at our live version of the Telekine Shield. So same duration, however, the base cooldown has been lowered by 5 seconds to 40 seconds, which should be a buff in some regards. However, let's start on the left with the single pane. What we can see here immediately is that Enervating Threshold and Bolstered Shield have swapped positions, which is a great change. This benefits this ability a lot because this is obviously the stronger of the 2 nodes. This is the node that you guaranteed want. This one is a little bit more flavor and can be very useful, but this one is the one that you want for the bare minimum functional utility of the shield. However, you notice there is one change here. We have a 40-second base cooldown, which is lowered by 5 seconds, but there is no more modifier here that adds that 35-second cooldown instead. So we have actually gained 5 seconds of cooldown, which seems like a lot, right? But the functional, or the important thing to take away today is you need to look at it in terms of percentages and not flat seconds, because the Psyker doesn't really care about time as you or I do. He tends to bend the rules, especially with like the most common builds that use these shields. So what we're going to envision this as, instead of being a change of 5 more seconds on 35 to go to 40, is just increasing or reducing the amount of shields you'll put out by 1/7, right? You're going to be able to only put out every 40 seconds. You're only going to be able to put out 1 shield instead of every 35 seconds. So that's going to be like, or 1/8 less even, right? Only 1/8 less shields over the course of the game, which doesn't seem that impactful. Okay, over here on the telekine dome side, things are a little bit different though. This got a really, really big nerf. This seems sizable, and then we're going to break down whether or not it actually is in practicality. Telekine dome has the same spherical 25-second duration. However, the cooldown has been bumped up to 60 seconds. Over the base cooldown of 40 seconds, that is 50% more, right? And over the previous base cooldown of 45 seconds, that's 33% more. So if you picture it, like I was saying before, you are going to be casting shields roughly 33.3% less often, because you have that cooldown being increased by like 1/3, which is quite a lot, right? But in order to answer whether or not this has really changed the power of this ability, whether it's going to impact it in any real way, we need to run the math and figure out how often were Psykers actually casting this bubble, because I gather it's probably not a thing that people are thinking about, how often the bubble can and is generally up, and how you can get it to be in the ready to go position. So let's analyze the first and most common way to build the bubble, and it's something like this, right? This is a general flame staff build. This is probably the most common meta setup for the bubble Psyker, so this is kind of what I'm going to go with here. This will give us a good baseline for probably what Fat Shark was intending to target with this nerf, which is just bubbling all the time, standing inside, using the flame staff, immolating everything, no danger to you, no danger to your team. And let's break down the number of ways. How does this 60-second cooldown functionally change over the old 45-second cooldown? So the first thing we need to do is analyze, okay, do we actually have to wait 60 full seconds to get this shield? The answer there is quite obviously no. There are sources of cooldown reduction in this game, and there's one other change that happened with this patch, which was a nerf to this node right here, Psychonetics Aura. It went from a 60% cooldown regeneration for 5 seconds to a 50% cooldown regeneration for 5 seconds, which another nerf to cooldown. So we have to take both of those things into account. Not only did we have a big increase in the base cooldown of this ability, but also we had a slight decrease in the effectiveness of our cooldown regeneration. So let's go ahead and crack into the actual math behind this ability and understand where it's at right now with the cooldown. How long are you waiting to put a bubble shield up with the current way this is? And then we'll look at how it was in the past and we'll see the difference. So all we got to do is we got to take our cooldown of 60 seconds, which is the current cooldown for the bubble shield, and we have to take into account our cooldown reduction modifiers. And it's very important to note the order of operations in which the game does this. So we got a couple of different modifiers going into effect here. We have a modifier here for 10% reduction from Seer's Presence, which most Psykers are using. At least, this is probably one of the best auras in the game. So this is going to be on your build 9 times out of 10, especially if you're running for this. And then we also have cooldown reduction in our curios, 4% on each of these curios. You 100% are running this on Psyker, unless maybe you're running Scryer's Gaze, but 99.9% of the time you're just running it anyway, because it's just so good. So this together is 22% cooldown reduction. So the game just goes ahead and it lumps this together, at least in my calculations, it seems what it does. So all we got to do is multiply this by the remainder of 78%. It's going to reduce it by 22, leaving us with 78%. And that means that if we just cast this ability, we should be seeing 46 on the cooldown timer, 46.8. Okay, so let's go ahead and test that in theory here. Let's make certain I don't have warp charges. I kind of get rid of warp charges rather than just like waiting around all day. Okay, I guess I just got to wait around all day. Hold on 1 second, guys. Oh wait, no, I can just cast the ability and reset the ability. Okay, there we go. So now I should just see, there you go, 46 seconds, right? So the math is mathing so far. Now we have to take into account the second really, really big source of cooldown on this class, which is Warp Siphon. Now, again, for this mostly meta build with Bubble, Psyker, and Flame Staff, again, so commonly you are running Warp Siphon, because Warp Siphon is not only base damage, but it is a massive, massive source of cooldown, plus it has amazing synergy with Fire and Flame Staff within Fire Reborn here, which is going to give you this 10% chance to create these warp charges. What do warp charges do? They give you base damage, and more importantly for our conversation here, they lower your cooldown of your combat ability when you cast it by 7.5% per warp charge, and you can carry up to 6 of them with this little modifier here, which again, almost everybody's taking. So what that effectively means is this will lower it by 45%. And that is going to be taken into account after the fact. So what we'll see is that this number right here will pop up initially, and then it'll get cut by another 45%. So we can multiply that by 0.55, the remainder, and then we'll be left with something like this, 25.74. So all we got to do is just check that in practice. Go ahead and get our stacks up here. That's how hard it is to get the stacks up. And so watch the cooldown timer there underneath my hexagon. 46 and then cuts it to 25, right? You saw it in a 1-2 step. So those two, it cuts the first 22% off from our curios and our aura, and then it cashes in all 6 of those stacks and cuts it down to 25 seconds. So that theoretically should be our practical time to get a bubble back up, 25.74 seconds. But look, the bubble only lasts 25 seconds, and I have my cooldown back. How did I get it back beforehand? Ah, well, you forgot. Psykinetics Aura, right? Psykinetics Aura, 50% cooldown regeneration for 5 seconds. What that effectively means in practice, for those of you who play at like any level that has elite enemies in it, this is 100% uptime ability, right? Because, I gotta kill these enemies. They're just not driving me crazy. What this means is, if anybody in your coherency with you kills an elite or specialist every 5 seconds, at least once every 5 seconds, you get 50% additional cooldown regeneration, which is like nigh constantly. That is like nearly 100% uptime. And effectively, what this is doing is it's going to give you 1.5 seconds of cooldown for every real-time second that elapses. So that means all we have to do is divide this by 1.5, and this is the number of real-time seconds you will wait to get another bubble. So 17.16, so basically 17 seconds is how long you're waiting from one bubble to the next if you can manage to get 6 stacks before you cast, which is pretty easy to do if you're effectively coating enemies in fire and you're playing in coherency with your team, right? So that is the reality of the current bubble. 17 seconds to get a bubble, which normally has a cooldown of 60 seconds. So as you can see here, the Psyker has a pretty tenuous very, very lightly suggested relationship with an actual fucking cooldown. He just kind of makes up his own rules. Let's go ahead though and see how bad this nerf is as compared to what it was previously. So previously, remember, we had a 45-second base cooldown. So that's what we're going to start with here. So we'll do a 45-second base cooldown, and then we will hit it with those curios in the aura. So 0.78 multiplier, and then we'll hit it with that having 6 stacks of warp charges up. So a 0.55 multiplier, leaving us 19.3. And then we have to take into account that previously this right here, the Psykinetics Aura, was giving 60% cooldown regeneration for 5 seconds. So that was going to be dividing this by 1.6 instead of 1.5, leaving us with 12 seconds. So in real terms, we have gained a little bit over 5 seconds between bubble casts. That is the real implication of this. Now, if you aren't playing with Warp Siphon, the math does change a little bit. Let's assume a build that is instead using empowered psionics. This would be the other common pick to use with this sort of setup. In this case, we don't have the secondary consideration of Warp Siphon to calculate it in. So then the calculation just comes down to those first 2 steps, right? We would have either the old way of a 45-second cooldown with a 78% multiplier, giving us 35, and then that is going to be divided by 1.6. So we would have a real-time cooldown of 22-ish seconds. And nowadays, we're going to have a 60-second times 0.78, and then a real-time reduction of 1.5. So this is a big increase, right? This is a much larger increase, really, like, because the cooldown is 50% longer, or 33% longer. We're ending up at over 30 seconds to get this cooldown back, instead of the current modern day, or the past modern day of like 19 or whatever it was, 21 seconds or whatever it just showed. So yeah, that is the, what did it say? Yeah, 22 seconds. Yeah, that's the real implication here, is that this Psykinetics, Empowered Psionics degree is worse for Bubble. Now, there is another consideration here, which is Bolstered Shield, because Bolstered Shield, there are builds out there that use Bolstered Shield with Empowered Psionics, because this plus our Kinetic Resonance node here can be used to very quickly cast this ability over and over and over again. And if you just do the math on the Bolstered Shield, you can see why, right? Previously, Bolstered Shield had a 35-second cooldown because that was part of the add-on for the ability, and that means that if you were using this Empowered Psionics, what you'd get is you'd multiply this by 0.78. That's for your cooldown reduction stuff, and then you would hit it with that real-time modifier of 1.6 seconds per second, ending up with a 17-second cooldown to get your shields back. And that's how it was in the past. Nowadays, it's just 40 times 0.78 divided by 1.5. And so now we're at 20 seconds. So as you can see, we're adding 3 seconds, or sorry, almost 4, a little bit, 3.75 seconds or so to this cooldown for Empowered Psionics. And practically that is making almost no difference. But I think the bigger difference here for the pain, you're adding 3, almost 4 seconds to the pain. However, you're potentially saving a node here, because a lot of builds don't use this. And for a Psyker, nodes are pretty impactful. There's a lot of pretty dang good stuff you can get with 1 extra point. So you could be picking up something down here like Essence Harvest or Inner Tranquility, or you could be picking up more generation up here, more damage, more evasiveness or something. Lots of different options for you in the tree in those senses. So honestly, I think that generally playing with the shield, the pain, has not really gotten all that different in the grand scheme of things. A 4-second nerf to its cooldown and a betterment of placement with the talent points. I think that's kind of a wash, personally. And then when we consider the bubble, if you consider the practicality of it, this bubble is up every 25 seconds, or lasts for 25 seconds, and nowadays it is up every, what did we come up to? Every 17 seconds? Previously, it was at every 12 seconds. And therein lies the problem, or it was the problem. So this is actually where I want to comment on this nerf and tell you that, and I know I'm going to get probably some flack from this, from the Never Nerf crowd, but this nerf is genius. This nerf is going to be very good for the health and balance of the game in the long run. Because right now, in my opinion, and I've thought a lot about this, as you might imagine, having a channel about it and all, but right now, one of the biggest problems facing Darktide is how does the AI director deal damage to the players? And in order to actually do that, because it has to do that, right? If you don't deal damage to the players, they can't lose. Every player has to have their health lowered to 0 in order to cause you to lose a game. And so in order to take wins from players, then the AI director has to get damage done. And if you have really powerful, low cooldown defensive abilities, like the Bubble, like Shout, like the previous incarnation of Chorus of Spiritual Fortitude, where you could get that thing up in like less than 15 seconds, then that job for the AI director becomes next to impossible. Because if you're staggering and layering these things appropriately, then there is no window for the director to do anything. And that is your problem here, is the defenses aren't just strong, they're layered like an onion, right? You peel back the bubble, And then you have a tiny, tiny window before the next bubble's coming up. And so then you're like, okay, blast them, guys. And then the shout comes out. You're, okay, keep blasting. Okay, you finally break the gold toughness. Oh, here's the chorus. And the chorus itself lasts for 7 seconds. The bubble's back up again. And then you got to rinse and repeat. And the real problem becomes like, okay, so first of all, you got to catch the enemies in order to hurt them. And that's one of the things that only like bosses and shooters can really do, because most other melee jobber enemies can get staggered and they're slow. There's no way for them to get to the team because they'll just like get annihilated. They can use terrain to their advantage, but shooters can generally always hit the team, and bosses are pretty fast and will just run straight into the team. But Bubble ignores shooters. So if the game is like, all right, we're pulling all stops, it's time to give them a big challenge, make them fight for it, and it spawns a bunch of gunners, and then you just put the bubble up, well, then that spawn was effectively no challenge for the team because they can kill them all from the safety of the bubble. And let's consider the sort of two use cases for the bubble, the two cases here. And this is where I think this is really genius and will help, sort of make these engagements better. So the thing that will not change with the bubble, and the reason the bubble is still going to be so fucking good, if I haven't been, stressing enough that it's still going to be really fucking good, is in the scattered shooters case, right? In a lot of cases, there are like these little annoying gunners who just get themselves entrenched on some random piece of scenery way off in the fucking distance. And no one's going to be arsed to try and shoot them because they're covering and they're waiting there for 20 seconds where they take a single shot. But as soon as you turn your back, they're going to shoot you in the back of the head. And especially on Havoc, those guys can do a lot of damage to you if you're not paying attention to them. Plus, they're like really hard to notice a lot of times. So those enemies are super frustrating. The bubble says, nah, fam. They don't deal very much damage to the bubble's overall health pool because it has quite a bit of HP. And for that purpose, because the bubble has effective cooldown that's less than the duration of the bubble, you're still going to have like 100% uptime, right? As we calculated, the bubble is probably having somewhere around a 25-second cooldown, generally like minimum or like maximum. So we're going to have a more or less full uptime on the bubble in those low intensity situations. However, there's another case where the bubble is extremely toxic and makes the balance of the game like tenuous at best. And that's when the bubble's getting absolutely ass blasted. The bubble has a minimum 5-second duration. So even if the bubble's taking 1 quadrillion damage per second, it will still last 5 seconds. And then in that 5.001 second, it'll burst instantly, right? Because all that damage is pouring into it. But in practicality, it does still take about 2 to 3 seconds to actually explode. So you'll get a 5-second grace period, and then it'll take a little bit of time to actually break. So let's say 6 seconds, right, is how long the bubble will last if there's just an insane amount of gunners, like Reapers and Gunners are just blasting you, right? Well, with the minimum cooldown that we could get previously, good Psykers are getting that cooldown up, you're looking at like a 12-second, as we calculated, a 12-second refresh. So there's only a 6-second window after this bubble's burst from crazy amounts of gunfire before another bubble comes up, and it's a refresh, and it gets you another 5 seconds of immunity. And remember, what's going on in this 6-second window? Well, first of all, when they're in the bubble for those guaranteed 6 seconds, they're regenerating 10% toughness per second. So they're getting all their toughness back, which can take you into gold toughness if you have the gold buff. Then when it bursts, there's only 6 seconds, so the clock is ticking. The enemy's got to get their damage done. So this is when they're shooting, but there's shout, and you can dodge, and there's a chorus that could go out, and then by the time they really do anything, the bubble's back up again, and the bubble's locking out even more damage, and then rinse and repeat. And so what this effectively translated into is the gameplay equivalent of the StarCraft Terran siege tank strategy. Unsiege the back half of your tanks, move them in front of the front half of the tanks, unsiege that back half, and just walk it across the map and just shit stomp the Zerg, right? There's no chance for the enemy to Zerg rush you or to range you down because you're always within the safety of the bubble or, close, it's within a couple seconds of cooldown. However, with the current nerf, with a 17-second minimum cooldown for the bubble, what'll happen is if the bubble's getting absolutely blasted to shit, it bursts at 6 seconds, and you've got now an 11-second window before, at minimum, you have this thing up again. So you went from having only a minimum 6 seconds to wait for the bubble to almost double that of 11 seconds. And this is where it's going to be really impactful. It negates that strategy of just, oh no, shit's hitting the fan. Just keep throwing bubbles down. Just keep bubbling. And it just completely cucks all ranged enemies forever. Now you actually have to think about your bubble placement. A bubble is a very valuable thing, but you don't want it to get annihilated instantly. Now it matters because there's a big long window. If you fuck it up and get it destroyed instantly, you're going to have to wait at least a little bit to get another one. And that, I think, is going to really help overall the balance of the game, because if you start realizing, if Fat Shark looks at it and they're like, okay, well, now players are actually getting killed like way too fast by gunners. What was stopping that before? Oh, it was the fact that the bubble was always up. Well, then what they can do is they can look at the damage of gunners and the damage of enemies. And this is a part of an overarching thing. I'm doing a video, or I'm about to do a video on like ranking all the abilities in the game. And almost all of the best abilities in the game are OP defensive bullshit, because they can stack, they can layer, and by necessity, if you have super powerful defensive abilities with low cooldowns in the game, in order to counter that, in order to deal damage to the players, you have to crank the fuck out of the enemy density and the enemy damage. And this is how we end up with Havoc 40 or whatever, having these balance issues where a single shitty gunner can kill you in like 3 shots, where the Sword Captain and or Rinda Karnak do, I think it's like 150 damage with a single swipe. So you insta-die if you don't have like full toughness to the first attack. That is, in my approximation, too much. And I think that most of us would agree that generally you don't die to like little tickles of damage and like a war of attrition where, oh man, I took a hit there, oh man, I'm getting low on health, it's a nail biter, I wonder if I'll make it. That's what the intended experience for Darktide is. But the current experience is, holy fuck, I just got blown up in like a millisecond, what the fuck happened? Because the game is having to pull out all stops to annihilate you in 1 millisecond when your bubble's down, your chorus is down, your shout is down, and in order to do that, it also spawns like 15 bursters in a conga line to blow your asshole open. And that is something that hopefully we can start this nuclear disarmament by lowering our defenses a little bit, lowering our damage a little bit, and then we can lower the enemies, and we can like sort of cool the MMO vibes that I've been getting lately. But that's just my overall thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments, and hopefully you're excited about using more shields. I really like the shield. I've always liked the shield. Hopefully this gets more diversity out there. I think it's at least good from that perspective. And hopefully also that you enjoyed the video and the discussion. Thanks for watching so far, and I'll see you next time, guys. Mr. Riot, bye-bye.